everyone. Welcome back to Mental Wealth Reads. We're going to continue with Trauma and Recovery by Edith Herman. We're going to jump right in. Again, it's going to be a kind of a longish video. I think this little chunk we're going to do is going to be about 9 pages. So buckle in for a little bit of a long one here. It's going to be part 2 of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is quite as long. So we're going to get right into it. The effect of social support. Because traumatic life events invariably cause damage to relationships, people in the survivor's social world have the power to influence the eventual outcome of the trauma. A supportive response from other people may mitigate the impact of the event, while a hostile or negative response may compound the damage and aggravate the traumatic syndrome. In the aftermath of traumatic life events, survivors are highly vulnerable. Their sense of self has been shattered. That sense can be rebuilt only as it was built initially, in connection with others. The emotional support that traumatized people seek from family, lovers, and close friends takes many forms, and it changes during the course of resolution of the trauma. In the immediate aftermath of the trauma, rebuilding of some minimal form of trust is the primary task. Assurances of safety and protection are of the greatest importance. The survivor, who is often in terror of being left alone, craves the simple presence of a sympathetic person. Having once experienced the sense of total isolation, the survivor is intensely aware of the fragility of all human connection in the face of danger. She needs clear and explicit assurances that she will not be abandoned once again. In fighting men, the sense of safety is invested in the small combat group. Clinging together under prolonged conditions of danger, the combat group develops a shared fantasy that their mutual loyalty and devotion can protect them from harm. They come to fear separation from one another more than they fear death. Military psychiatrists in the Second World War discovered that separating soldiers from their units greatly compounded the trauma of combat exposure. The psychiatrist Herbert Spiegel describes his strategy for preserving attachment and restoring the sense of basic safety among soldiers at the front. We knew once a soldier was separated from his unit, he was lost. So if someone was getting tremulous, I would give him the chance to spend the night in the kitchen area, because it was a little bit behind, a little bit protected, but it was still our unit. The cooks were there, and I would tell them to rest, even give them some medication for sleep. And that was like my rehab unit. Because the traumatic neurosis doesn't occur right away. In the initial stage, it's just confusion and despair. In that immediate period afterwards, if the environment encourages and supports the person, you can avoid the worst of it. Once the soldier has returned home, problems of safety and protection do not generally arise. Similarly, in civilian disasters and ordinary crimes, the victim's immediate family and friends usually mobilize to provide refuge and safety. In sexual and domestic violence, however, the victim's safety may remain in jeopardy after the attack. In most instances of rape, for example, the offender is known to the victim. He is an acquaintance, a work associate, a family friend, a husband, or a lover. Moreover, the rapist often enjoys higher status than his victim within their shared community. The people closest to the victim will not necessarily rally to her aid. In fact, her community may be more supportive to the offender than to her. To escape the rapist, the victim may have to withdraw from some part of her social world. She may find herself driven out of a school, a job, or a peer group. An adolescent rape survivor describes how she was shunned. After that, it was all downhill. None of the girls were allowed to have me in their homes, and the boys used to stare at me on the street when I walked to school. I was left with a reputation that followed me throughout high school. Thus, the survivor's feelings of fear, distrust, and isolation may be compounded by the incomprehension or frank hostility of those to whom she turns for help. When the rapist is a husband or lover, the traumatized person is the most vulnerable of all, for the person to whom she might ordinarily turn for safety and protection is precisely the source of danger. If, by contrast, the survivor is lucky enough to have supportive family, lovers, or friends, their care and protection can have a strong healing influence. Burgess and Holmstrom, in their follow-up study of rape survivors, reported that the length of time required for recovery was related to the quality of the person's intimate relationships. Women who had a stable, intimate relationship with a partner tended to recover faster than those who did not. Similarly, another study found that the rape survivors who were least symptomatic on follow-up were those who reported the greatest experience of intimate, loving relationships with men. Once a sense of basic safety has been reestablished, the survivor needs the help of others in rebuilding a positive view of the self. The regulation of intimacy and aggression, disrupted by the trauma, must be restored. This requires that others show some tolerance for the survivor's fluctuating need for closeness and distance, and some respect for her attempts to reestablish autonomy and self-control. It does not require that others tolerate uncontrolled outbursts of aggression. Such tolerance is, in fact, counterproductive, since it ultimately increases the survivor's burden of guilt and shame. Rather, the restoration of a sense of personal worth requires the same kind of respect for autonomy that fostered the original development of self-esteem in the first years of life. Many returning soldiers speak of their difficulties with intimacy and aggression. The combat veteran Michael Norman testifies to these difficulties. Unsettled and irritable, I behaved badly. I sought solitude, then slandered friends for keeping away. I barked at a son who revered me and bickered with my best ally, my wife. This testimony is borne out in studies. The psychologist Josephina Card found that Vietnam veterans commonly reported difficulties getting along with their wives or girlfriends, or feeling emotionally close to anyone. In this regard, they differed significantly from their peers who had not been to war. Another study of Vietnam veterans' readjustment documented a profound impact of combat trauma. Men with post-traumatic stress disorder were less likely to marry, more likely to have marital and parenting problems, and more likely to divorce than those who escaped without the disorder. Many became extremely isolated or resorted to violence against others. Women veterans with the same syndrome showed similar disruptions in their close relationships, although they rarely resorted to violence. In a vicious cycle, combat veterans with unsupportive families appear to be at high risk for persistent post-traumatic symptoms, and those who have post-traumatic stress disorder may further alienate their families. In a study of the social support networks of returning soldiers, the psychologist Terence Keane observed that all men lost some of their important connections in civilian life while they were away at war. The men with post-traumatic stress disorder gradually built back their supportive networks once they returned home. But the men who suffered from the persistent syndrome could not rebuild their social connections. As time passed, their social networks deteriorated even further. The damage of war, in fact, may be compounded by the broad social tolerance for emotional disengagement and uncontrolled aggression in men. The people closest to the traumatized combat veteran may fail to confront him about his behavior, according him too much latitude for angry outbursts and emotional withdrawal. Ultimately, this compounds his sense of inadequacy and shame and alienates those closest to him. The social norms of male aggression also create persistent confusion for combat veterans who are attempting to develop peaceful and nurturant family relationships. The social worker Sarah Haley quotes a veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder who had managed to marry and have a family, only to develop an acute recurrence of his symptoms when his toddler began to play with war toys. I thought I could handle it, but on Christmas morning, between the G.I. Joe doll and the toy machine gun, I came unglued. We'd had a bad time with the 3-year-old, and I didn't know how to sort it out. I guess I was naive. All kids go through it, but it really threw me because I'd been like that in Vietnam. I thought I'd made him like that, and I had to make him stop. This man was preoccupied with the gratuitous cruelties he had committed as a soldier, and with the fact that no one in a position of authority had intervened to prevent them. His irritability at home reminded him of his early uncontrolled aggression in Vietnam. Ashamed of both his past actions and his current behavior, he felt like a poor excuse for a father, and wondered whether he even deserved to have a family. This man, like many other combat veterans, was struggling with the same developmental issues of aggression and self-control as his preschool child. The trauma of combat had undone whatever resolution of these issues he had attained in early life. Women traumatized in sexual and domestic life struggle with similar issues of self-regulation. In contrast to men, however, their difficulties may be aggravated by the narrow tolerance of those closest to them. Society gives women little permission either to withdraw or to express their feelings. In an effort to be protective, family, lovers, or friends may disregard a survivor's need to reestablish a sense of autonomy. Family members may decide on their own course of action in the aftermath of a traumatic event and may ignore or override the survivor's wishes, thereby once again disempowering her. They may show little tolerance for her anger or may swallow up her anger in their own quest for revenge. Thus, survivors often hesitate to disclose to family members, not only because they fear they will not be understood, but also because they fear that the reactions of family members will overshadow their own. A rape survivor describes how her husband's initial reaction made her feel more anxious and out of control. When I told my husband, he had a violent reaction. He wanted to go after these guys. At the time, I was already completely frightened and I didn't want him exposed to these people. I made myself very clear. Fortunately, he heard me and was willing to respect my wishes. Rebuilding a sense of control is especially problematic in sexual relations. In the aftermath of rape, survivors almost universally report disruption in their previously established sexual patterns. Most wish to withdraw entirely from sex for some period of time. Even after intimate relations are resumed, the disturbances in sexual life are slow to heal. In sexual intercourse, survivors frequently re-encounter not only specific stimuli that produce flashbacks, but also a more general feeling of being pressured or coerced. A rape survivor reports how her boyfriend's response made her feel re-victimized. During the night, I woke up to find him on top of me. At first, I thought the rapist was back and I panicked. My boyfriend said he was just trying to get me used to things again, so that I wouldn't be frigid for the rest of my life. I was too drained to fight or argue, so I let him. My mind was completely blank during it. I felt nothing. The next day, I took my last exam, packed my things, and left. I broke up with my boyfriend over the summer. Because of entrenched norms of male entitlement, many women are accustomed to accommodating their partner's desires and subordinating their own, even in consensual sex. In the aftermath of rape, however, many survivors find they can no longer tolerate this arrangement. In order to reclaim her own sexuality, a rape survivor needs to establish a sense of autonomy and control. If she is ever to trust again, she needs a cooperative and sensitive partner who does not expect sex on demand. The restoration of a positive view of the self includes not only a renewed sense of autonomy within connection, but also renewed self-respect. The survivor needs the assistance of others in her struggle to overcome her shame and to arrive at a fair assessment of her conduct. Here, the attitudes of those closest to her are of great importance. Realistic judgments diminish the feelings of humiliation and guilt. By contrast, either harsh criticism or ignorant, blind acceptance greatly compounds the survivor's self-blame and isolation. Realistic judgments include a recognition of the dire circumstances of the traumatic event and the normal range of victim reaction. They include the recognition of moral dilemmas in the face of severely limited choice. And they include the recognition of psychological harm and the acceptance of a prolonged recovery process. Harshly critical judgments, by contrast, often superimpose a preconceived view of both the nature of the traumatic event and the range of appropriate responses. And naively accepting views attempt to dismiss questions of moral judgment with the assertion that such concerns are immaterial in circumstances of limited choice. The moral emotions of shame and guilt, however, are not obliterated, even in these situations. The issue of judgment is of great importance in repairing the sense of connection between the combat veteran and those closest to him. The veteran is isolated not only by the images of the horror that he has witnessed and perpetrated, but also by his special status as an initiate in the cult of war. He imagines that no civilian, certainly no woman or child, can comprehend his confrontation with evil and death. He views the civilian with a mixture of idealization and contempt. She is at once ignorant and innocent. He views himself, by contrast, as at once superior and defiled. He has violated the taboo of murder. The mark of Cain is upon him. A Vietnam veteran describes this feeling of being contaminated. The town could not talk and would not listen. "How'd you like to hear about the war?" he might have asked, but the place could only blink and shrug. It had no memory and therefore no guilt. The taxes got paid and the votes got counted and the agencies of government did their work briskly and politely. It was a brisk, polite town. It did not know shit about shit, and did not care to know. The veteran leaned back and considered what he might have said on the subject. He knew shit. It was his specialty. The smell in particular, but also the numerous varieties and textures and tastes. Someday, he'd give a lecture on the topic, put on a suit and tie, and stand in front of the Kiwanis Club and tell the fuckers about all the wonderful shit he knew. Pass out samples, maybe. Too often, this view of the veteran as a man apart is shared by civilians, who are content to idealize or disparage his military service while avoiding detailed knowledge of what that service entailed. Social support for the telling of war stories, to the extent that it exists at all, is usually segregated among combat veterans. The war story is closely kept among men of a particular era, disconnected from the broader society that includes two sexes and many generations. Thus, the fixation on the trauma, the sense of a moment frozen in time, may be perpetuated by social customs that foster the segregation of warriors from the rest of society. Rape survivors, for different reasons, encounter similar difficulties with social judgment. They, too, may be seen as defiled. Rigidly judgmental attitudes are widespread, and the people closest to the survivor are not immune. Husbands, lovers, friends, and family all have preconceived notions of what constitutes a rape and how victims ought to respond. The issue of doubt becomes central for many survivors because of the immense gulf between their actual experience and the commonly held beliefs regarding rape. Returning veterans may be frustrated by their families' naive and unrealistic views of combat, but at least they enjoy the recognition that they have been to war. Rape victims, by and large, do not. Many acts that women experience as terrorizing violations may not be regarded as such, even by those closest to them. Survivors are thus placed in the situation where they must choose between expressing their own point of view and remaining in connection with others. Under these circumstances, many women may have difficulty even naming their experience. The first task of consciousness raising is simply calling rape by its true name. Conventional social attitudes not only fail to recognize most rapes as violations, but also construe them as a consensual sexual relations for which the victim is responsible. Thus, women discover an appalling disjunction between their actual experience and the social construction of reality. Women learn that in rape, they are not only violated but dishonored. They are treated with greater contempt than defeated soldiers, for there is no acknowledgement that they have lost in an unfair fight. Rather, they are blamed for betraying their own moral standards and devising their own defeat. A survivor describes how she was criticized and blamed. It was just so awful that my mother didn't believe I had gotten raped. She was sure I had asked for it. My parents so totally brainwashed me that I wasn't raped that I actually began to doubt it. Or maybe I really wanted it. People said a woman can't get raped if she doesn't want to. By contrast, supportive responses from those closest to the survivor can detoxify her sense of shame, stigma, and defilement. Another more fortunate rape survivor describes how a friend comforted her. I said, "I'm 14 years old and I'm not a virgin anymore." He said, "This doesn't have anything to do with being a virgin. Someday you'll fall in love, and you'll make love, and that will be losing your virginity. Not the act of what happened." He didn't say rape. That doesn't have anything to do with it. Beyond the issues of shame and doubt, traumatized people struggle to arrive at a fair and reasonable assessment of their conduct, finding a balance between unrealistic guilt and denial of all moral responsibility. In coming to terms with issues of guilt, the survivor needs the help of others who are willing to recognize that a traumatic event has occurred, to suspend their preconceived judgments, and simply to bear witness to her tale. When others can listen without ascribing blame, the survivor can accept her own failure to live up to ideal standards at the moment of extremity. Ultimately, she can come to a realistic judgment of her conduct and a fair attribution of responsibility. In their study of combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, Herbert Hendon and Ann Haas found that resolving guilt required a detailed understanding of each man's particular reasons for self-blame, rather than simply a blanket absolution. A young officer, for example, who survived after a jeep in which he was riding ran over a mine and exploded, killing several men, blamed himself for surviving while others died. He felt that he should have been driving the Jeep. On the face of it, this self-criticism was completely unfounded. Careful exploration of the circumstances leading up to the disaster revealed, however, that this officer had been in the habit of avoiding responsibility and had not done everything he could to protect his men. When ordered by an inexperienced commander to embark upon the trip in the Jeep, he had not objected, even though he knew that the order was unwise. Thus, by an act of omission, he had placed himself and his men in jeopardy. In this metaphorical sense, he blamed himself for not being in the driver's seat. Similar issues surface in the treatment of rape survivors, who often castigate themselves bitterly, either for placing themselves at risk or for resisting ineffectively. These are precisely the arguments that rapists invoke to blame the victim or justify the rape. The survivor cannot come to a fair assessment of her own conduct until she clearly understands that no action on her part is in any way absolves the rapist of responsibility for his crime. In reality, most people sometimes take unnecessary risks. Women often take risks naively, in ignorance of danger, or rebelliously, in defiance of danger. Most women do not in fact recognize the degree of male hostility toward them, preferring to view the relations of the sexes as more benign than they are in fact. Similarly, women like to believe that they have greater freedom and higher status than they do in reality. A woman is especially vulnerable to rape when acting as though she were free. That is, when she is not observing conventional restrictions on dress, physical mobility, and social initiative. Women who act as though they were free and often described as loose, meaning not only unbound but also sexually provocative. Once in a situation of danger, most women have little experience in mobilizing an effective defense. Traditional socialization virtually ensures that women will be poorly prepared for danger, surprised by attack, and ill-equipped to protect themselves. Reviewing the rape scenario after the fact, many women report ignoring their own initial perceptions of danger, thereby losing the opportunity for escape. Fear of conflict or social embarrassment may prevent victims from taking action in time. Later, survivors who have disregarded their own inner voice may be furiously critical of their own stupidity or naivete. Transforming this harsh self-blame into a realistic judgment may in fact enhance recovery. Among a few positive outcomes reported by rape survivors in the determination to become more self-reliant, to show greater respect for their own perception and feelings, and to be better prepared for handling conflict and danger. The survivor's shame and guilt may be exacerbated by the harsh judgment of others, but is not fully assuaged by simple pronouncements absolving her from her responsibility, because simple pronouncements, even favorable ones, represent a refusal to engage with the survivor in the lacerating moral complexities of the extreme situation. From those who bear witness, the survivor seeks not absolution from fairness, compassion, and the willingness to share the guilty knowledge of what happens to people in extremity. Finally, the survivor needs help from others to mourn her losses. All of the classic writings ultimately recognize the necessity of mourning and reconstruction in the resolution of traumatic life events. Failure to complete the normal process of grieving perpetuates the traumatic reaction. Lifton observes that unresolved or incomplete mourning results in stasis and entrapment in the traumatic process. Chaim Shaitan, observing combat veterans, speaks of their impacted grief. In ordinary bereavement, numerous social rituals contain and support the mourner through this process. By contrast, no custom or common ritual recognizes the mourning that follows traumatic life events. In the absence of such support, the potential for pathological grief and severe persistent depression is extremely high. The role of community. Sharing the traumatic experience with others is a precondition for the restitution of a sense of a meaningful world. In this process, the survivor seeks assistance not only from those closest to her, but also from the wider community. The response of the community has a powerful influence on the ultimate resolution of the trauma. Restoration of the breach between the traumatized person and the community depends first upon public acknowledgement of the traumatic event, and second upon some form of community action. Once it is publicly recognized that a person has been harmed, the community must take action to assign responsibility for the harm and repair the injury. These two responses, recognition and restitution, are necessary to rebuild the survivor's sense of order and justice. Returning soldiers have always been exquisitely sensitive to the degree of support they encounter at home. Returning soldiers look for tangible evidence of public recognition. After every year, soldiers have expressed resentment at the general lack of public awareness, interest, and attention. They fear their sacrifices will be quickly forgotten. After the First World War, veterans bitterly referred to their war as the Great Unmentionable. When veterans groups organize, their first efforts are to ensure that their ordeals will not disappear from public memory. Hence, the insistence on medals, monuments, parades, holidays, and public ceremonies of memorial, as well as individual compensation for injuries. Even congratulatory public ceremonies, however, rarely satisfy the combat veterans' longing for recognition, because of the sentimental distortion of the truth of combat. A Vietnam veteran addresses this universal tendency to deny the horror of war. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. Beyond recognition, soldiers seek the meaning of their encounter with killing and death in the moral stance of civilian community. They need to know whether their actions are viewed as heroic or dishonorable, brave or cowardly, necessary and purposeful or meaningless. A realistically accepting climate of community opinion fosters the reintegration of soldiers into civilian life. A rejecting climate of opinion compounds their isolation. A notorious example of community rejection in recent history involves the war in Vietnam, an undeclared war, fought without formal ratification by the established processes of democratic decision-making. Unable to develop a public consensus for war, or to define a realistic military objective, the United States government nevertheless conscripted millions of young men for military service. As casualties mounted, public opposition to the war grew. Attempts to contain the anti-war sentiment led to policy decisions that isolated soldiers both from civilians and from one another. Soldiers were dispatched to Vietnam and returned to their homes as individuals, with no opportunity for organized farewells, for bonding within their units, or for public ceremonies of return. Caught in a political conflict that should have been resolved before their lives were placed at risk, returning soldiers often felt traumatized a second time when they encountered public criticism and rejection of the war they had fought and lost. Probably the most significant public contribution to the healing of these veterans was the construction of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. This monument, which records simply by name and date the number of the dead, becomes, by means of this acknowledgement, a site of common mourning. The impact and grief of soldiers is easier to resolve when the community acknowledges the sorrow of its loss. This monument, unlike others that celebrate the heroism of war, has become a sacramental place, a place of pilgrimage. People come to see the names, to touch the wall. They bring offerings and leave notes for the dead, notes of apology and of gratitude. The Vietnam veteran Ken Smith, who now organizes services for other veterans, describes his first visit to the memorial. I remembered certain guys. I remembered certain smells. I remembered certain times. I remembered the rain. I remember Christmas Eve. I remember leaving. I'd been in a couple of nasty things there. I remember those. I remembered faces. I remembered. To some people, it's like a cemetery, but to me, it's more like a cathedral. It's more like a religious experience. It's kind of this catharsis. It's a hard thing to explain to somebody. I'm a part of that and will always be. And because I was able to come to peace with that, I was able to draw the power from it to do what I do. In the traumas of civilian life, the same issues of public acknowledgement and justice are the central preoccupation. In the traumas of civilian life, the same issues of public acknowledgement and justice are the central preoccupation of survivors. Here, the formal arena of both recognition and restitution is the criminal justice system, a forbidding institution to victims of sexual and domestic violence. At the basic level of acknowledgement, women commonly find themselves isolated and invisible before the law. The contradictions between women's reality and the legal definitions of that same reality are so often extreme that they effectively bar women from the participation in formal structures of justice. Women quickly learn that rape is a crime only in theory. In practice, the standard for what constitutes rape is set not at the level of women's experience of violation, but just above the level of coercion acceptable to men. That level turns out to be high indeed. In the words of the legal scholar Catherine McKinnon, rape, from women's point of view, is not prohibited, it is regulated. Traditional legal standards recognize a crime of rape only if the perpetrator uses extreme force, which far exceeds that usually needed to terrorize a woman, or if he attacks a woman who belongs to a category of restricted social access, the most notorious example of which is an attack on 2 white women by a black man. The greater the degree of social relationship, the wider the latitude of permitted coercion, so that an act of forced sex committed by a stranger may be recognized as rape, while the same act committed by an acquaintance is not. Since most rapes are in fact committed by acquaintances or intimates, most rapes are not recognized in law. In marriage, many states grant a permanent and absolute prerogative for sexual access, and any degree of force is legally permitted. Efforts to seek justice or redress often involve further traumatization, for the legal system is often frankly hostile to rape victims. Indeed, an adversarial legal system is of necessity a hostile environment. It is organized by a battlefield in which strategies of aggressive argument and psychological attack replace those of physical force. Women are generally little better prepared for this form of fighting than for physical combat. Even those who are well prepared are placed at a disadvantage by the systematic legal bias and institutional discrimination against them. The legal system is designed to protect men from the superior power of the state, but not to protect women or children from the superior power of men. It therefore provides strong guarantees for the rights of the accused, but essentially no guarantees for the rights of the victim. If one set out by design to devise a system for provoking intrusive post-traumatic symptoms, one could not do better than a court of law. Women who have sought justice in the legal system commonly compare this experience to being raped a second time. Not surprisingly, the result is that most rape victims view the formal social mechanisms of justice as closed to them, as they choose not to make any official report or complaint. Studies of rape consistently document this fact. Less than 1 rape in 10 is reported to police. Only 1% of rapes are ultimately resolved by arrest and conviction of the offender. Thus, the most common trauma of women remains confined to the sphere of private life, without formal recognition or restitution from the community. There is no public monument for rape survivors. In the task of healing, therefore, each survivor must find her own way to restore her sense of connection with the wider community. We do not know how many succeed in this task, but we do know that the women who recover most successfully are those who discover some meaning in their experience that transcends the limits of personal tragedy. Most commonly, women find this meaning by joining with others in social action. In their follow-up study of rape survivors, Burgess and Holmstrom discovered that the women who had made the best recoveries were those who had become active in the anti-rape movement. They became volunteer counselors at rape crisis centers, victim advocates in court, lobbyists for legislative reform. One woman traveled to another country to speak on rape and organize a rape crisis center. In refusing to hide or be silenced, in insisting that rape is a public matter, and in demanding social change, survivors create their own living monument. Susan Estrich, a rape survivor and professor of law, gives her testimony. In writing about rape, I am writing about my own life. I don't think I know a single woman who does not live with some fear of being raped. A few of us, more than a few really, live with our own histories. Once in a while, say at 2 o'clock in the morning, when someone claiming to be a student of mine calls and threatens to rape me, I think that I talk too much. But most of the time it isn't so bad. When my students are raped, and they have been, they know they can talk to me. When my friends are raped, they know I survived. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 3. And there was certainly quite a lot in this. I'm not going to talk forever about it, but certainly there are things that I do want to allow as a takeaway, right? And the overall part, or the overall theme of this chapter, or this section of the chapter, is that social connection piece, right? That importance that not only is society better at accepting the grief and just the overall emotions of people returning from combat, people returning from war in general, and even survivors of rape or sexual assault or violence in general, right? Not only do we need to be better about receiving them and allowing their emotions to be the emotions that are appropriate, right, to what is going on, but also keeping in mind the necessity of establishing connections with people in general prior to, right? And of course you can't necessarily guess that somebody's going to be raped in the future in X amount of months, right? So it's not like you can just, prepare to be like, oh, I should be friends with her because when she gets raped, it's going to be easier for her. Like, that's obviously not a thought process you can have, or should have. Hopefully you don't have that thought process. But the actual value in establishing meaningful connection with the people around you, that's not just going to prepare somebody for any sort of trauma that they experience, but it's going to help improve their life, in more ways than just, now they have a friend. There have been so many studies that have quantified or qualified, really, results that indicate the value of connection in terms of illness, connection in terms of mental health in general, right? And how that all plays into the general survival of a person, right? Not just physical survival, but mental and emotional survival too. And so one point that they make in this book, or in this chapter specifically, is how there is, or has been, and certainly does continue to be, maybe to lesser degree, but it's still there, a shortfalling within the military in establishing a better connection with amongst its ranks, right, amongst the people in it, and as I say, my experience has just been that's better, right? We're not being sent off to war without having any sort of connection to the people we're going to war with. And I would say, for the most part, if I get sent to war, there's somebody in my life that agrees with that, right? At the very least, I personally am not going to get flack for going there, because at this point in history, I think people understand more that it's more of a commander-in-chief kind of decision, right? And as a member of the military, I am obligated to answer the call to go to war, or go to on a deployment or mobilization, right? And so I'm not going to necessarily get as much criticism from the people in my life or in my environment as much, and so that's going to help me going into it. However, it does point out that there's something very critical about the friendships that you have and the friendships that you maintain while going through that experience as well, right? It's important, as I said, to make sure that if you're somebody who is going to a deployment, right, that you keep those connections really strong as well as you can. And if you are the friend of someone or a contact of somebody who is going to war, I cannot stress how important and valuable and meaningful and impactful it is to stay in contact as much as you can. It, of course, is sometimes a little tricky, as, not everyone gets sent to a place that is easy to keep in contact with. There are, however, methods of contact nowadays in the 21st century that we're in, that whether it takes a while for mail to get there or not, you can still get it there, right? And I can even say, even from a perspective of having, been through basic training, getting letters during basic training is still meaningful, since phones aren't allowed for the majority of the time. Getting a letter from someone, even if it's somebody who you haven't talked to in a while, is still very meaningful. So that's kind of the one general takeaway I want to leave with you guys. There's a couple other things too that are kind of below, like subsections of that. And it's one, being able to grieve, right? They mentioned that a bit. Being able to grieve properly the loss that they've gone through. And some units, some people are lucky enough to have gone through an entire experience without having lost anybody. Some missions are not combat missions. Some missions are just maybe behavioral health or maybe more humanitarian, right? However, there is something that is lost no matter what, right? These soldiers are gone from the civilian world for X amount of time, right? And the military is all that they are for 9 months plus, right? That's a loss in a way, right? They lost the ability to have a life where they are not having to be on alert, 24/7. Whereas the rest of us get to stay back and enjoy that, albeit riddled with anxiety or depression as it is nowadays, but there's still much more of a freedom within the civilian community, and that's something that they point out too, as something that can be kind of isolating within a soldier coming home and realizing I don't know how to explain what I just went through. Even if nothing bad happened, I don't know how to explain what I just went to, because it's an entirely different experience there that most people don't experience, right? And two, there's another thing that they pointed out. They used a lot of words for this, but the being believed, right? And this spans not only just within the military community, but also as they mentioned with rape survivors and survivors of sexual assault and other kinds of violence, right? It is so important that somebody's story is believed. That's actually a lot of we'll call it magic of therapy, is that you come to me as your therapist and you tell me your story and I believe you, right? Unless I happen to know that you are not telling the truth for some reason or another, right? I don't know how I would know, but unless I know, like, okay, I believe what you are telling me, and I believe that those things that you're telling me, those are affecting you in the way that you're telling me they're affecting you, right? And it is a very common thing for civilians to want to like oversaturate with honor, or gratitude or some sort of, like they said, platitudes about like, oh man, we can never do what you do, and on a basic level, those are appreciated. However, if you are talking with somebody who has been to a war, a combat zone, right? That's not going to cover it, right? Because just being thankful and grateful and appreciative of what this soldier has done and has gone through, like, I'm sorry to say it doesn't mean as much, simply because, they may have done it for patriotic reasons, but they also did it because they had to, they weren't, necessarily, thinking, oh, I'm going to go and acquire PTSD because that is how much I care about this country, right? There are numerous reasons why a person joins the military, and like I said, they're not always patriotic. Sometimes it's a business move or a financial move, or sometimes they just needed to get into a different environment. Sometimes they just wanted to make a whole life change, right? They wanted to learn, they wanted to improve, right? And those are all good reasons to join the military. But the fact is, like I said, coming back from a hard experience like that, from a traumatizing experience like that, it's not always going to make that person feel better to know that you're grateful that they went and did that, right? And so that's the whole believability piece, right? The believability and the acceptance, right? The general acceptance of, you know, I'm not happy about what I just went through, right? I truly don't care right now that you find some level of patriotism in my actions that I didn't actually have, right? And so right now I need to express that what I went through was absolutely bogus, like it absolutely unfair, absolutely, and it points out too, there's a lot of that that judgment, right? That judgment is a huge piece, right? It's very, very important that a person is able to regain their better judgment, not just about their lives, but themselves, right? How can I come back from an experience of combat where I had to kill somebody and still think of myself the same way I did before I had this experience? That's going to jar you all the way up, right? And so it really is important, like I said, to be aware that that's what's going on inside a combat veteran. That's what's going on inside a military person too, in general, right? How can I am someone who I believe is a good person who would not willingly do harm to someone in any other situation. How can I justify what I had to do, right? And so if you are somebody who is going through that as a survivor of combat, please know that there are ways to heal from that, right? And I know the book says sweeping generalizations isn't a great way to go about it. I don't have time to go through every last detail of reasons why things are going to be okay. But just know, from me, someone who both understands the military life, as I am a part of it, and to somebody who's a therapist, what you had to do over there was something you had to do. You didn't have as much choice as you believe you did, right? And that's what they talk about in the book. There's this choice in situations of extreme, right? It's always easier to look back and think, man, I could have done something differently. You most certainly always could have. But when you're under military assignment and somebody says you must do this thing, you don't have much of a choice that's going to end the way that you need it to, right? It's a very, continue mission kind of thing, right? I'm going to end with that. This video is a little bit long. Again, like I said, it was going to be, but a little bit longer than I meant to. But just know, as the takeaway, like I said, if you're somebody who has experienced something traumatic, your best road to healing is going to be exploring that judgment in yourself, right? How do you judge yourself right now? And how do you think other people judge you? And finding that place where you want to get to in terms of judgment, right? How do I want to feel about myself eventually, right? And then experiencing or going through the journey of processing where you are right now and getting to that point. Because like I said, it can happen, and it will, right? And if you're somebody who is the friend or family or lover, whatever, family member of somebody who's gone through something like this, either trauma or rape or sexual assault or combat, please be aware, as they mentioned in the chapter, your loved one is going to be going through a roller coaster of emotions, right? It's not going to be as even keel as they may seem when they first come home, right? Or when they initially come, after the experience of whatever they went through, right? There's a period of shock, where you're just glad to be out of that experience, right? But then once reality comes crashing in and you have to now be a part of, the real world again, right? It's going to be hard, right? Because you're on this level of alert that you don't need to be anymore. That's going to seem extreme, and that's going to frustrate you because you're going to think about yourself that I should be able to handle this, right? This is less than what I've been doing the last 9 months, or this this thing that I'm going through is much less scary than the rape that I experienced recently or the sexual assault, but I can't handle it, right? So if you're a loved one, like I said, please be mindful of that. This person's emotions are not going to be streamlined. They're not going to make sense all the time, and that's okay. That is the body basically like making known that something's wrong, and then we need to fix it, right? And if, like I said, if you are that person, please know there's help. If you don't have or don't feel like you have people to turn to, you do. I will say this in every video, every podcast, everything that I do, right? There are therapists waiting to help you. You know, even people with military experience like me, waiting to help you figure that out, right? With that, like I said, I'm going to let you guys go. If you guys want anything more talked about from this chapter, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to do another little excerpt for you, or even just write a blog post about it. If not, I'll see you guys in the next video, and thank you for watching. Take care.